you my story today, but we get to make a deal. I'll share my story, but then I get to ask you about your stories. Does that sound okay? We have a deal? Okay, so my story begins with one of my earliest memories as a kid. I was about 5 years old, 5.5, because 5-year-olds love to say they're 5.5, right? And the memory is I'm on a bus with my mom, my sisters, I have 2 little sisters, my brother, and my dad with a bunch of people. And I remember running out of this bus and being told to run under a hillside and crouch there. And as a curious little 5-year-old, I'm crouching there with my mom, who also had my sister, and I was afraid. I didn't know where my dad was. We somehow got separated in the shuffle. And I asked my mom, what should I do? You know, and I'm like looking up like this. And my mom just put her hand on my head and pushed down, and she said, keep your head down and pray. And that was one of my earliest memories. And I didn't know what was happening that day, but I understand now that it was part of my family's journey getting out of Afghanistan. And my dad, who at the time was one of the few literate men of his time, he was a really cool guy. He was almost 30 years old, maybe a little less than that, which is still in that cool age range. He had Elvis Presley sideburns because, there's a lot of European and American influence, right? He had bell bottoms. He was a science teacher, and his class was so cool. You'd go in, and he had these press displays of insects and leaves and specimens on his walls, and his students adored him because he was that cool science teacher. So my dad, that cool science teacher with the bell bottoms and the sideburns, got in trouble. There was a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was actually a coup. And my dad participated in an act of resistance. And you have to kind of understand the time, right? We didn't have Google back then. So he distributed anti-communist literature because he was a patriotic guy, because he loved his country, and because he was literate. That was his act of resistance. And he was distributing this literature, and they found out. And it got very ugly if the Russian occupiers figured out that you were participating in any act of resistance, whether it was physical or, in his case, intellectual. People would disappear, homes would be looted, you'd get tortured, you'd disappear, and God knows what happened to you after that. So we found out, and we had to leave very quickly. And I also remember that night, leaving in the middle of the night, not saying goodbye to my grandparents or anyone else. And that was actually my last time as a 5.5-year-old ever going back to Afghanistan. I've never been back since. And we ended up embarking on this very long terrain that involved the bus, that involved a tractor for part of the journey because there was very rough terrain and we had to be on this tractor bed with a bunch of people by foot. And that particular memory of me praying on the hillside with my mom and asking what's going on and what am I supposed to do, we were just praying that the Russian jet that went over our heads was not going to use that bus for target practice because that was their practice at the time, just for fun. They would sometimes blow up civilian buses heading away from the border. And another memory of that same bus ride was when a man with a rifle came on board and he searched several people on that bus, fortunately not my dad. And he took 2 people out, and I don't know what happened to them at that point. But my parents were prepared for the inspectors at the border because the Russians really didn't want people to leave because this is what cruel governments often do, right? They abuse their people and then they keep them from leaving, so you're trapped. And so they were checking people at the borders, they were checking buses, and our bus driver had told my parents, you Kabulis, you people from Afghanistan, you're a little bit on the lighter side than the Pakistanis. So if people come on the bus, they're gonna be able to tell that you're Afghan and not Pakistani. So if they're in the bus, turn your head away. And if they're outside of the bus, look inside so they don't get a good view of your faces. And so my parents did that and they avoided any kind of detection on that bus ride. So we eventually ended up going to Pakistan and we made it out of the border. Pakistan was another long saga. My dad was stranded in the embassy for weeks and it was kind of soul-crushing. He would spend 10 hours, 12 hours a day there. He wouldn't get answers. His paperwork wasn't being processed. Maybe he didn't speak the language. Maybe he didn't understand the paperwork. Maybe he didn't know that they needed a bribe from him. He wasn't sure. But on one of these days that was really long, a man came up to him, a young man, and recognized him and embraced him. And my dad realized that this was one of his former students. And my dad told me this story recently, and he got very choked up. And he It wasn't just the memory that was making him choked up. He was proud that he had a student that loved him and respected him, and he had this love in his heart for his students. And when he told me this story, I also just realized that it was a huge reason why I went into teaching. And that love that you feel for your students and that difference that you make in their lives, even years later, that you've earned their respect and their love. And I realized that he has given me that without even having known this story all my life. I knew from his lessons that this was an important thing for him. So with that student's help, he helped my dad navigate his paperwork. And again, I didn't even know this story until a few months ago when I happened to talk to him. And we ended up getting out of Pakistan and we got visas to go to India. And I ended up going to kindergarten in India, which was really cool. And I met my first friend there. His name was Chalandar, and he was the son of our Sikh landlord. And he was my very first friend outside of Afghanistan, and it was a wonderful experience. We were eventually accepted from India to Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, as refugees by the Reagan administration, who, believe it or not, gave priority registration status to Afghans back then. Yeah, we were the cool kids back then, you guys. Yeah, Afghans. And so at the age of about 29 and 30, my parents and their 4 kids under the age of 10 made it out, and we settled in Wisconsin. So how's my story going so far? Do you like it? It's a good story? All right. It's a good story, right? I eventually went on to college. I got my PhD. I taught for many, many years. I impacted the lives of thousands of students during this time, a work that has been just enormously fulfilling to my heart. And my brother went on to be an engineer. My sister owns the best Mediterranean restaurant in San Francisco in the financial district. So I have a lot of these stories, but sometimes our stories become exciting and they warm our hearts and they give us good feelings, but nothing else happens from that. And I'm hoping that for me today, you remember more than my story, and that's my goal for us today. So remember I said I'd ask you about your stories? All right. Well, I'm going to ask you about your stories and about your scripts, and I want you to push back and think about them a little bit more and reconsider them. Is it true? Because sometimes stories like mine can confirm the goodness of our hearts and can confirm stories that America is this land of opportunity, that America opens doors to people like me, and it did. But what if that story is not true for everyone? What if my dad's application for refugee status was denied by the US government? What if we fell ill at the Pakistani border? What if the government put us in detainment centers? What if I died of exposure or hunger or disease? What if Afghans were called rapists and criminals and put on the no list at that time? What would happen to that next Marina? What if she was not welcomed, that English teacher who grew up to love all of these students and love our educational process? Who would teach all of those students during this time? What if she's currently somewhere waiting and detained and possibly separated from her family? What's happening to that next Marina, that next refugee success story? So the 5 stories of yours that I hope that you can push back on and think about and interrogate and flip today are the following. The first story is that refugees and immigrants are all in one lump, that we think about them exactly the same way. And it's not really true. Refugees are people that can't go back, and if they do, they'll be executed, tortured, trafficked. They'll be subjected to some kind of violence. Their children will be hurt. They will be hurt. And it's not always from the same place. It could be from Afghanistan, it could be from Syria, but also places like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have experienced dramatic escalations in violence in recent years and have some of the highest recorded murders in history. So when we think about that, I want you to really think broadly about where refugees come from and what causes them to become refugees. The second story about refugees is that they come here because they want to work, they want to send money home, they're just here for the money and the opportunity, and they're not in danger. And I want you to think back about my parents. My parents were both teachers. They were middle class, they owned their own home, they had support, they had love around them, they grew up in a country where they were literate and doing great. They wouldn't leave that unless there was a horrible circumstance that drove them out. Currently, there are millions of refugees from Syria who have settled in neighboring countries like Lebanon, and they were doctors and dentists and accountants, and they had good lives, and now they're living under bridges. because at least they're alive and at least they're safe. So again, people don't leave home unless home becomes a prison for them or it becomes something very ghastly for them and their families. Also remember that half of all refugees worldwide are children. That's almost 1 in every 200 kids in the world. And of those people, 3.5 million of them are school-aged, but they have no access to school. So the third story, don't worry, there's only 5 stories. The third story is that they're needy and they're gonna come and eat up all of our resources. You know, they're gonna be on welfare and we're gonna have to support them and they're gonna have a bunch of kids. My dad, when he came to Wisconsin, his first job was cleaning tables at a restaurant, and my mom would make cheesecakes at that same restaurant at night because she couldn't interact with people, she didn't speak English. And so within a couple of years, he went from being a dishwasher to a server, he washed dishes, he became a sous chef. Within 3 years in Wisconsin, he became the head chef of this very fancy Italian restaurant. So think about that. Think about how hard you have to work for an Afghan man, all right, who was a science teacher, to become a head chef at an Italian restaurant in Wisconsin. You gotta work pretty darn hard to get there. And he did. That was his work ethic. I worked since I was 13, and so did every one of my siblings. And a lot of studies show that where refugees settle, there are positive economic indicators due to consumer demand and due to their entrepreneurial activities. The fourth story is one that we hear about actually quite recently, which is that there's bad guys, there's terrorists that are hiding amongst so-called refugees. And in fact, the current president said earlier this month, we have terrorists coming in through that southern border because there's a caravan of refugees from the south coming to our border. And the idea that this big wall will keep them away. So a statistic from the Cato Institute found that between 1975 and 2017, so more than 40 years, 7 people entered the US tied to countries that were loosely affiliated with terrorist activities. Of those 7, all came from Canada and US ship ports. And that's not to minimize terrorism. We don't want a single act on our ground, but just to give you an idea about coming in as refugees. Over the last 4 decades, 20 people out of the 3.25 million refugees welcomed to the US have been convicted of attempting or committing terrorism on US soil. And only 3 Americans have been killed by refugees, all by Cuban refugees in the 1970s. The last story that I'm going to ask you to reconsider and interrogate about refugees is that all we can do is feel sorry for them and pity them. You can pity people like me and my family. And you might think, well, I'm not one of those people that think they're criminals. I don't think they're these huddled, unwashed masses coming to take over our resources. I think about them, I have compassion for them, and I feel badly for them, and I think about them. So 10 years ago, there were 38 million refugees in the world. Today, we're at 65 million. Just to put that in perspective, that's like every single person in California, plus every single person in Texas put together. Hungry, stranded, stuck with their families. That's how many refugees there are in the world. So I would say, can you do more than feel bad or good about their human stories? And before I leave you today, I'd like you to think about a few things that you can do if you want to change your story. And I'd like to leave you with these suggestions. There's only 4. Number 1, consider hosting, meeting, or feeding a refugee family. There are refugee families here in Mission Viejo. They live in Irvine. They're all around you. Some of them don't need a lot of help, like my family. We're on the helping side now, but some truly need your help. So you can meet them. There are groups that will connect you to actual families living near you. You can help them with things like creating a resume, setting up a bank account, getting a driver's license, working on their resumes and email accounts, and things that will help them to become independent, functioning members of society. If you don't have time for that, please consider donating to a nonprofit agency that will support them. And lastly, if you don't have time or money, advocate for them, name them, speak for them, and think of me and my parents and my family members and use our human stories that touch your heart to open your hands and to open your homes. Thank you.